Good morning and welcome to another breakfast talk here at the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center. My name is Richard Hanley. I am the director of the center, and we are going to have a good program for you on Brooklyn's wind power that will uh, be coming in the near future. Before that, I would just like to take a couple of minutes uh, to acknowledge that today is the first national holiday of Juneteenth. And Juneteenth, as everyone knows by now, but perhaps didn't um, until a short time ago, um, marks the day of uh, when the slaves in Texas were told that they were free after the Emancipation Proclamation told them that approximately 2 years, 2.5 years earlier. Um, I also, you might have noticed on the screen, I had the cover of a novel by Ralph Ellison, most famous for his novel Invisible Man, and he also wrote a novel called Juneteenth. Ralph Ellison, by the way, I'm an English professor, so I can speak about these things, I guess, and he's one of my favorite novelists. His work is very deep and rich. He was a prolific writer, but he only wrote and had published in his lifetime the one novel, Invisible Man. He was working on a second novel uh, called called Juneteenth. And in 1967, there was a fire and it was completely destroyed. It was close to being finished. And so he worked on that for the next 2 or 3 decades. He died in 1994, still hadn't, he still hadn't published and put together and edited the, the novel, but it was put together and published by his executor in 1999. So, with that, I just want to recognize that the country's starting to celebrate a new national holiday today. And I think it is about time that we recognize that. Okay. And so now let's proceed to talk about Empire Wind and what this means for Brooklyn and the Brooklyn waterfront. And we have with us three speakers from different perspectives on this. And we have Jana Herndon, who is from NYSERDA. She is the project manager of Offshore Wind, and she's involved in many aspects of NYSERDA's program, including stakeholder engagement, supply chain development, and contract management. Jana has several years of experience working to advance policies to address the impacts of climate change in the marine environment. She has a Master's of Public Administration in Environmental Science and Policy from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. We have Alba Pena, who's the Community Engagement Manager of Equinor Wind, the developer of the project. And Equinor Wind she focuses on stakeholder engagement for the Empire Wind project in New York, specifically within the Brooklyn community. And that's why we welcome her with open arms today. Alba's work spans from educating and gaining and engaging communities in Equinor's offshore wind developments to working with various institutions such as environmental, academic, and governmental, ensuring that as an organization, projects remain within the confines of responsible development. And finally, we have with us someone also nearby who is Summer Sandoval. She's the Energy Democracy Coordinator at UPROSE. She completed her Master's of Science in Sustainable Environmental Systems at Pratt Institute and started her position as the Energy Democracy Coordinator at UPROSE. In that role, she leads many energy democracy campaigns, from developing Sunset Park Solar, New York's first community solar cooperative. By the way, we had a breakfast talk on that a couple of years ago. And she's which fights peak power with Peak Coalition, and implementing a local just transition through UPROSE's community-led comprehensive waterfront plan called the Green Resilient Industrial District Plan, GRID. And if you have not yet taken a look at that, you really should. And so before I turn this over to our first speaker, Jana, I would like to welcome you all to use the chat during the course of the talks, and also, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we will answer questions after we have heard from each of the speakers. And so now it is my pleasure to introduce and to give the screen, instead of a stage over, to give the screen over to Hannah Herndon.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center for inviting me to speak here today. Good morning to all of the participants. Looking forward to having a morning chat about offshore wind before engaging in some Juneteenth learning and conversations later today, and I hope everyone is doing the same. So I'll take a moment to share my screen. As Richard said, I'm Jana Herndon, project manager with the offshore wind team at NYSERDA. NYSERDA is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, and I'm happy to talk to you today about the state's role in offshore wind development. New York State has a number of ambitious clean energy goals, which became law in 2019 with the signing of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, often called the Climate Act for short. So I'll just highlight a few of those goals on this slide. One goal is for us to provide 70% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2030, and by 2040 to have 100% zero emissions electricity. So offshore wind is set to be a very big part of that, as I'll talk about on the next slide. We have a goal to develop 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind energy by 2035, which will be enough to power approximately 6 million homes. And by 2035, that will equate to about a quarter of New York's electricity load. And when we talk about developing offshore wind, we're not only talking about renewable power, but we're also talking about billions of dollars of investments in New York's economy, as well as jobs. And we approximate 10,000 jobs from the achievement of this 9,000 megawatt goal. So there's a number of excellent reasons why we should develop offshore wind in New York State. And one of the primary reasons is that the wind resource off of the Atlantic coast is tremendously strong. So there's enormous potential to capture that energy and provide renewable energy into the areas of our state where demand is highest. And I'm talking here about New York City and Long Island, those densely populated areas that don't have the available land space to develop large-scale onshore renewable energy projects like those that you'll see upstate, those big solar and wind farms on land. But we have this tremendous resource off of our shore, and that allows us to inject energy into those areas where electricity demand is highest. As I mentioned, offshore wind will bring significant investments in the New York economy, including infrastructure, particularly port infrastructure, and I'll talk more about that later. It will create thousands of both short and long-term skilled jobs with very high average salaries, and will contribute to a more diverse and resilient electricity supply. So offshore wind will work together with other forms of clean energy, like solar, like onshore wind, hydro, to create this more diverse portfolio that we'll need in the future to create a reliable, resilient electricity system. And more importantly, renewable energy avoids those harmful greenhouse gas emissions that you get from traditional generation sources that burn fossil fuels. This is essential in our fight to combat climate change. So this picture on the left side, the right side, just gives you a sense of the scale of an offshore wind turbine. All the way on the right side, you'll see the GE Halliide X turbine, which is the largest turbine currently in production. And you can see that it's quite huge. The components of these turbines are enormous. A single blade can be 350 feet long. This just reinforces the importance of port infrastructure, because certainly these components are very big. They can't come down roads, they can't come down Main Street anywhere in New York. So it's essential that we invest in our waterfront in order to accommodate these wind farms and this scale of production. I'll talk a little bit about New York State's role in the development of offshore wind and how that compares to the federal role and the role of private industry. So to start with, offshore wind farms are being developed in federal waters. Those are waters greater than 3 nautical miles from our shore. So specifically, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management within the Department of Interior, which is often called BOEM for short, is responsible for the siting of wind energy areas in federal waters, as well as the leasing of those areas to private developers. And then the federal government also has a very important role in overseeing all of the permitting processes in accordance with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. New York State plays a number of roles in offshore wind development, but once a project crosses that 3 nautical mile line wanting to connect to New York's electricity grid, it becomes a New York project. And there are a number of New York State agencies involved. So not only is NYSERDA involved in offshore wind development, but also the Department of State, the Department of Public Service, the Department of Environmental Conservation. So from NYSERDA's perspective, we're involved in offshore wind in that we release solicitations for offshore wind energy, and developers bid into our solicitations in order to enter into long-term revenue contracts for the offshore renewable energy certificates. Those are the positive environmental attributes associated with an offshore wind project. So we contract directly with developers. We also work very closely with stakeholders across the state. We work in stakeholder engagement, supply chain and workforce development, extensive research, and of course, there are also state permitting processes that are handled by other agencies within New York. And then briefly, we have a developer with us today. Alba is with Equinor, so I'm sure she'll be talking extensively about the developer's role in offshore wind development. But the developer is responsible for all aspects of offshore wind project design, finance, operation, and as I'm sure Alba will talk about, they also are working very closely with stakeholders throughout the development process as they complete their federal, state, and local permitting requirements and develop local supply chains and workforce. So I wanted to take a step back here to look more broadly at the region and how the East Coast of the United States is developing offshore wind. So you'll see on this pie chart that New York has the largest goal for developing offshore wind, that 9,000 megawatt goal. But we're not alone. There are many other states that have commitments to developing offshore wind energy. That gives us a regional market potential of more than 39,000 megawatts, or 39 gigawatts. And that's really important for attracting investments from the global industry. Offshore wind has been in development in other parts of the world for 3 decades, and this is a brand new industry to the United States. So these commitments are really important in signaling to the global industry that we are serious about developing offshore wind and that they should very seriously be considering local investments in our supply chain and in our workforce. This map on the right side shows you in blue those areas in federal waters that have already been leased by the federal government to offshore wind developers. And those areas outlined in red have also been identified by the federal government as future wind areas. Those areas in green have recently been announced as areas that will be leased in the next round of the BOEM leasing process. And this is just to show you that, not all of these areas, will inject energy into New York's grid, but there's certainly a lot of offshore wind energy coming to the region. As far as New York is concerned, we have 5 projects in active development right now. Those projects together total more than 4,300 megawatts, which brings us almost halfway to our goal of 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. So NYSERDA has contracted with 4, or is in the process of contracting with 4 of these projects. Starting back in 2018, we issued our first solicitation for offshore wind, and you'll be able to see those areas in the slashed blue were the 2 offshore wind projects awarded as a result of that solicitation in 2018. So that's the Empire Wind 1 project and the Sunrise Wind project. Empire Wind, as you will hear shortly, is owned by developer Ecuador in partnership with BP, and Sunrise Wind is developed by Ørsted in partnership with Eversource. Then in 2020, we awarded 2 additional projects, both from Equinor. That's Empire Wind 2 and Beacon Wind. And then you'll notice in the gray hashing, there is a South Fork wind farm. That will be New York's first offshore wind farm. It's a much smaller project, 130 megawatts. And NYSERDA is actually not involved in that project. That is a direct contract with the Long Island Power Authority, but very important for New York, as it will be the first offshore wind project to be constructed and operating and delivering renewable energy into our grid. Also on this map, you'll see points of interconnection, proposed interconnection. So the South Fork wind farm is proposing to interconnect into the East Hampton substation out on the eastern end of Long Island. The Sunrise Wind project will connect to the Holbrook substation in central Long Island. The Beacon Wind project will connect through the Long Island Sound to the Astoria substation in Queens. Empire Wind 1 will connect to the Gowanus substation in Brooklyn, and Empire Wind 2 will connect to the Barrett substation in Nassau County. You'll also notice those yellow dots. Those are ports that will be utilized by these projects for a variety of uses. That might be manufacturing. It could also be staging and assembly of turbine components, as well as serving as the basis for long-term operations and maintenance of these offshore wind projects. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. But together, all of these projects will bring more than 7,000 direct jobs to New Yorkers and a combined economic activity of over $12 billion. Recently, as in today, I believe, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management announced an important step in the progress of the Empire Wind project. Alba may touch on this a bit more, but they've issued a notice of intent to prepare an environmental impact statement for the Empire Wind 1 and 2 construction and operations plan. And that's an important step in moving through the federal permitting process. So talking a bit more about ports, you remember those dots on the previous map. The investments in port infrastructure is really what's going to facilitate our ability to seed a local supply chain for offshore wind. So currently, between public and private investments, there's more than $700 million being invested in New York's ports. There are 5 ports right now that have been slated for use by the offshore wind industry, but there are certainly many, many more port assets across New York. So that not only are the ports, on Long Island and in the New York City area, but up through the Hudson. the industry is viewing the Hudson River as sort of a floating assembly line whereby we can manufacture certain components of offshore wind turbines in that upstate capital region and then send them down the river to their ultimate destination out in those project areas. So for example, we will be having the nation's first offshore wind tower and transition piece manufacturing facility at the Port of Albany. And you can see that this is a rendering here on the right side of the screen. Additionally, there will be component manufacturing, component fabrication for potentially a variety of projects at the Port of Coymans, also up in the capital region. The South Brooklyn Marine Terminal is going to have several uses. It's very exciting, and I'm sure that the others will talk more about this as well. One is that it will serve as a state-of-the-art staging facility for large components, offshore wind turbine components, before they are loaded onto special ships and sent out to the ocean to be installed. It will also serve as a long-term operations and maintenance hub for Equinor's portfolio of projects. There are other operations and maintenance facilities noted here on this slide. That is Montauk Harbor out at the very eastern tip of Long Island, as well as Port Jefferson Harbor, also on Long Island. So these ports are slated for use by the industry and will result in, tremendous number of jobs and long-term supply chain investments throughout the state. So speaking of jobs, there are both public and private investments in workforce development that I want to note. One is the state has committed $20 million to an offshore wind training institute. The institute itself is a framework. It will be a network of educational institutions and training programs across the state that have the goal of educating 2,500 New Yorkers in the offshore wind industry. So that $20 million will be competitively awarded. And we held our first solicitation for the first $3 million recently. And that solicitation was specifically focused on bringing workforce training development programs to disadvantaged communities and priority populations. And we are very hopeful that we'll be able to announce the result of that solicitation shortly. And then there's plenty of money left to support additional training programs across the state. As noted on this slide, there's also $10 million that's been set aside to support training programs through the City University of New York. That was part of the FY22 budget. And there's also currently announced $15 million in combined private investments in workforce development and training and just access funding. And all of these efforts are meant to build strong partnerships between industry and the many different on-the-ground groups that are already working in New York State and have expertise in workforce development. So that's academia, labor, community groups, and of course, this is all in line with the Climate Act's focus on building an inclusive clean energy economy. So I just want to highlight also that the federal administration has set some ambitious goals with regards to offshore wind. They've set a goal of 30 gigawatts by 2030 and even 110 gigawatts by 2050. So the East Coast will certainly be instrumental in reaching some of these goals, as will the West Coast, utilizing different technologies. But certainly New York State is really encouraged by this announcement from the federal government. And a key part of that is also their commitment to proceed with critical permitting and environmental reviews. They've also committed to invest quite a lot of money in port infrastructure and offshore wind innovation. So not only does NYSERDA contract with offshore wind developers, but we're also committed to supporting regional collaboration through a number of different venues. So that's research, that's stakeholder engagement, that's supply chain development. I'll just highlight a few of the ways that we do that here. So we have 4 technical working groups: the environmental, commercial, fishing, maritime, and jobs and supply technical working groups. These groups convene experts in these fields in order to provide a forum for critical discussions on how to best go about offshore wind development with these specific interests in mind. And out of those groups come very concrete strategies and products. NYSERDA also leads our own offshore wind research, as well as regional collaboration on research that specifically supports fishing and wildlife data collection. NYSERDA's efforts with regards to both supply chain, workforce development, and stakeholder engagement are all committed to the pursuit of climate and energy equity, and working to advance benefits to disadvantaged communities, as is prioritized in the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And one thing I just want to highlight is that coming soon, hopefully August, I believe, we will be releasing a new suite of educational materials that will be called the Offshore Wind Youth Action Program. The goal is to empower young people to learn about offshore wind and teach them about ways that they can get involved in the future. And that could mean a future career in offshore wind. So I want to thank you for your time today. And if you are interested in learning more about offshore wind, I hope that you will register for some of the webinars as part of our Learning from the Experts webinar series. I've put a web address here on the screen. This is an ongoing webinar series where we have experts from different topics in offshore wind speak, and we're also very open to suggestions for future topics. So thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Jana, for that presentation. That was thorough, and it is exciting to see how much is going on and will be going on in this area. And we here at City Tech are also excited for the opportunities that this might offer for our students going forward. We're right in the neighborhood of where much of this is happening, and this is the community that we serve. So we are excited to hear that. And now I'm happy to transfer to our next speaker, Alba Pena, who is going to talk about the project from the developer's point.
Thank you, Richard. Bear with me 1 second as I share my screen.
Sure. In the meanwhile, let me ask if any of you have questions about the presentation that you just saw or heard. Just put them in the Q&A, and I see that many of you are making use of the chat function, and that is great. So continue to enjoy and learn.
Let me know if you can actually see my screen.
Yes, we can.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center for having me here today, alongside great partners that are NYSERDA and UPROSE, as well as the Brooklyn community at large and the New York community. It's a very important conversation that we're having today. And I also, like Jana, look forward to engaging in conversation as to what today or June 19th commemorates, which is tomorrow. Very important holiday that we have to discuss further. So as Richard mentioned, I am the Community Engagement Manager for Equinor. For those that are not familiar with Equinor, it's an international energy company founded in 1972 in Norway. But we do have a presence in the United States. We have some of our local offices in Stamford, Connecticut, Houston, Washington, D.C., and soon, very excitedly, in New York City. As you can see on this slide, we have a very clear purpose, vision, values, and strategy, which highly impact the way that we conduct our business. As a broad energy company, we have committed to net zero targets by 2050, and we're therefore ambitiously investing in renewables. So you can see on this slide, it portrays our offshore wind portfolio. Equinor has over 10 years of experience in the offshore wind sector. And as a result, so you can see we are quickly pursuing the development of offshore wind projects along the US East Coast, and becoming a leader in the country's offshore wind growing industry. We're also looking to grow in areas such as Asia and Brazil for future offshore wind growth. So that's very exciting. So let's dive into some of our projects. The main one, as Jana previously mentioned, some of this information about Empire Wind, which was awarded to us in 2019. It's an 816 megawatt project, which can potentially power over 500,000 homes in the New York City area. This section, which you see is the northwesternmost tip of that triangle that you see on the map on the left, the aqua color, and it's interconnecting into the South Brooklyn area. So it's the South Brooklyn substation. And we're very excited about that because that means a lot for the Brooklyn community as to what we're going to be doing in the sense of operations and maintenance in the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal in that area. We're looking to use gravity-based foundations to the largest extent possible for this project. And we're expecting this project to become operational in the mid-2020s. And I want you all to kind of get a sense of, sorry, I need to go forward, get a sense of how long these projects take. They're very lengthy from the time that you secure a lease as a developer to the time that you can actually construct and develop. It takes upwards of 6 years, where we currently just hit a milestone in the process of state and federal permitting, which means our BOEM has released our notice of intent, as Jana mentioned earlier. And that is a very, very exciting step for us as a developer. And it's inviting more of a robust public engagement where the community can go and opine on our construction and operations plans. And if the community is interested in providing their comments, that is another platform where they can go ahead and do so. We've done a lot of work already to engage the community, but as most developers know, it's never enough. So the more opportunities there are, the better. A little bit about our other two projects, and let me just, this screen is not letting me see. Okay, a little bit about our two additional projects which were awarded at the beginning of the year. Those include Empire Wind 2 and Beacon Wind 1. Empire Wind 2 is essentially the second phase of our Empire Wind 1 project, and you see that red area at the bottom of the initial Empire Wind project that I showed you on the map on the last slide. That one is interconnecting into the South Shore of Long Island, and it's a 1,260 megawatt project. That's a great opportunity for us to continue moving forward with our state goals in terms of renewable energy development. Alongside that, we have Beacon Wind, which is a 1,230 megawatt project interconnecting into Astoria, Queens. Jana had mentioned earlier all of the combined efforts that we're doing in the sense of workforce development, and Equinor is making huge investments in those efforts to ensure that there is a just transition and that there is training and employment and education going to innovation and community benefits, especially for those communities surrounding our development areas. And we're also investing largely in the regional monitoring of wildlife because, as you know, environmental studies are very, very crucial to these projects. And we want to make sure, once again, that we are developing these projects in a responsible way. And let's not forget to note that these projects combined, we're looking at over 5,000 jobs resulting from the manufacturing, the assemblies that these projects will bring to the Brooklyn, New York community. This is a rendering of the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal. Jana had mentioned earlier how important it is to invest in port infrastructure, especially when we're taking into consideration transporting such large components. And in this image, you'll see renderings of the tower components, some blades, nacelles, and we're making a huge investment to ensure that this is a state-of-the-art port, which we can essentially, after we're done leasing the space, it can become a larger, broader area where future offshore wind projects can develop as well. This will serve as the staging facility for all three projects, Empire Wind 1, Empire Wind 2, and Beacon. And it's one of the largest dedicated facilities spanning at 73 acres in the area. We're expecting this, the port infrastructure to result into over 1,000 jobs by 2028. And we'll also have operations and maintenance in this port, resulting in 200 jobs approximately. Something exciting about this is that we're looking to hopefully open our New York office adjacent to this space, and having a community center within so that we can continue those efforts to educate and invite the community into our projects. And they'll have a great visibility into the port and what's going on there. Here we go with Port of Albany. That's something that Jana also mentioned. It's a rendering of what we're looking to have. It's going to be the first offshore wind tower manufacturing facility in the US. We did not expect to see manufacturing of offshore wind towers in the US for like another 10 years. But here we are, contributing to those efforts to bring New York closer to being the leader in the offshore wind industry and bringing manufacturing to the United States as a whole. We're partnering with tower industry experts, Marmon and Vulcan, and we'll be producing the tower components for all three projects at the Port of Albany. This is a shared investment, and we're looking that this will result into about 500 short-term jobs and 300 long-term jobs. And the expectation is that this port becomes operational around 2023. Workforce development, as I mentioned earlier, it's beyond important to the organization as we have various conversations with stakeholders. We want to make sure that the surrounding communities are included and are hired, and that there is a just transition in the sense of education and training. We don't want these developments to take away from the community. We want to instead be able to train existing interested parties, create that institutional infrastructure of education and training. We're partnering with various institutions to ensure that that happens. One of the programs that I would mention that has an upcoming deadline for those that are interested is being held by Stony Brook University on offshore wind development. And it's going to be over the summer. It's a free program. It's information that I can provide after the presentation so that those that you know that are interested can join. It adds to the efforts that we're trying to make to create an easy and just transition. We're also working with local labor unions to ensure that everyone is included in this new and exciting offshore wind industry. What I'm showing here, it's a high-level list of some of the academic institutions, environmental institutions, and labor unions that we're working with. Of course, we have a way larger stakeholder list and community partners that we're working with to have these conversations, to have a collaborative platform where we're ensuring that this is not just benefiting the developer, but the community at large, because we should all be thriving in the offshore wind industry. And with that, I culminate my presentation. Again, thank you for having me join you today. As Jana mentioned, they have a great webinar which I recommend. NYSERDA has done a great job in developing those efforts for education and training. So I recommend that as well. And again, thank you again, Richard. I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alba. There'll be some good questions that are being asked, and it would be quite interesting to hear how the discussion goes. But first, it's our pleasure to welcome Summer Sandoval and to have her speak from the community's perspective on these developments. And so thank you, Summer. Right.
Thanks, Richard. Here, let me share my screen.
Sure.
Okay. Very good. So thank you again, and I want to especially thank Alba and Jenna for their very informative presentations, and really bring it back to, I'm going to go back a little bit in time to really discuss how offshore wind, and really bringing offshore wind not only to New York City, but having South Brooklyn play a big role, and to be an offshore wind and clean energy hub, how that work has been ongoing for decades. And so I'm going to really take the story back a little bit. But before that, I want to introduce Uprose. So again, my name is Summer Sandoval, and I'm the Energy Democracy Coordinator at Uprose. Really appreciate being able to be here today. And for those of you who don't know Uprose, we were founded in 1966. We're Brooklyn's oldest Latino community-based organization. We are an intergenerational, multiracial, Black, Indigenous, women of color led organization, as well as internationally recognized, working at the intersection of racial justice and climate change. Uprose is part of local, state, and national climate and environmental justice leadership, from being in coalitions, city coalitions, from the Climate Works for All coalition to state coalitions like the New York News Coalition, as well as being steering committee members of the National Climate Justice Alliance, part of passing climate and the most ambitious pieces of climate legislation on every level, from the Climate Mobilization Act in Local Law 97 to the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act to the Frontline Green New Deal on the national level. And really seeing building the connections from how all of these pieces of legislation are in alignment and works together, and what community-led models look like on the ground in terms of operationalizing these policies. And the community, Uprose has doubled the amount of open space, stopped the siting of polluting peaker plants, as well as developing community solar. So just giving a little bit of background here, and also, of course, being part of the long history of preserving the industrial character of Sunset Park's waterfront. And so, giving more context to the Sunset Park community, Sunset Park, for those who don't know, is located in Southwest Brooklyn. Sunset Park is also home to the largest significant maritime industrial area, as well as industrial business zone in New York City. Sunset Park is a predominantly community of color, with that is a frontline community vulnerable to the climate crisis, from extreme heat vulnerability to sea level rise and flooding and other extreme recurrent weather events. Considering much of the community does not have sufficient health care. This is a large immigrant community, and 41% of the community do not have a high school degree. And so, considering all of these factors, both climate vulnerability as well as systemic inequities and historic disparities, in really building out the picture of understanding what community-led models look like and what offshore wind really means to South Brooklyn, Sunset Park community is really at the heart of this. just a further breakdown of, who is the community. Like I mentioned, predominantly it's Hispanic and Asian community with a large Puerto Rican, Dominican, Mexican population, as well as a very large Chinese population, one of the largest Chinatowns in New York City. And now also looking at existing conditions, what's going on the ground, what has been happening in terms of infrastructure in the community for decades. These are just a few of the many environmental injustices and burdens that are located in the community, from the Gowanus Expressway that traverses the community from north to south, sees over 200,000 cars and 25,000 diesel trucks every single day. From the 2 solid waste transfer stations, 3 peaker power plants, and here underneath you can see the names of them. There you have the Gowanus plant, which is the largest, the Narrows plant, as well as the Joseph Seymour plant. All 3 within just about a mile or 2 from each other. Really understanding all of the pollution that the community is, dealing with on an everyday level. This is not even including the cement plant, brownfields, and really history of pollution, history of lack of resources and disinvestment. And here on the bottom, you see, citing an analysis that looks at the disproportionate exposure to pollutants like PM 2.5, as well as NOx and SOx. But, it's really also understanding that we don't need all of these studies to understand that fossil fuel infrastructure, that COVID, that climate change are all environmental justice issues that are going to impact frontline communities like Sunset Park the hardest. And really understanding in terms of how to move forward, we have to really truly understand the lessons from COVID, because there were some really, really big and fundamental environmental justice issues that were really shown a really bright light in the midst of the pandemic, and really understanding that if we're going to truly build a more resilient, a more equitable, and a more vibrant economy and future, that we have to truly understand the lessons learned from COVID and how we are going to integrate those lessons into policy, into investments, into decision-making processes to really foundationally change how things are developed, where money moves, and who's at the table making these decisions. So this is just obviously a very summarized list of some of the lessons from COVID, but and I'll go over a few. That energy, from some of the studies of just looking at the exposure, the incremental increases in exposure to particulate matter 2.5, a fine particulate matter pollutant that can get lodged deep into your lungs, and increase death from COVID, increased vulnerability to COVID, and really understanding the strong relationship between health and infrastructure. We have policy and the very expedient need to operationalize those policies and move those investments, make those allocations, move those investments to create well-paid and accessible, climate jobs, green jobs. That's going to really be at the heart of building this new economy and development. That we cannot let traditional or conventional private developers come into our communities and develop in a way that is not in alignment with community plans, and that we see these changes, and that this very much cookie cutter or conventional model of development, where we're just seeing the cause of so much gentrification and displacement, that these types of development are working retroactively against the policies that we've passed, against the investments in clean energy, and against building a resilient economy. And then, also community planning, which I'm going to get into with the grid, and that these plans are, made by the community, vetted by the community, and really gets at the heart of how to address multiple crises on the ground, and how these community-led models can be, just that, a replicable and scalable model for, the rest of the city and the country. And really understanding the multi-dimensional nature of resilience, and that you can't just look at environmental resilience. You can't just look at each resilience, and really about how to de-silo that framework. And that's very much the community framework, how to de-silo that framework to address all of the crises, to address all of these resilience, to truly see a more equitable future. And now I want to, get into what is the grid, and what does this have to do with anything? And so, as what was mentioned earlier, the grid stands for Green Resilient Industrial District. And the grid is a comprehensive community-led plan that really looks at how to bring all of these layers together to create jobs and to move investments and to really strengthen social cohesion and resilience. And so not just focusing on the industrial, sector, as you see in this map to the right, though that is a really big part of it, but it's comprehensive. So looking at all the different types of land use and zoning and policy, and how all of these can be working together, working towards the same goal. And so some of the goals of the grid is to preserve the industrial character of the largest industrial waterfront in New York City, and that is the basis of implementing the green reindustrialization of the waterfront, as we see industrial areas across the city shrinking, but being developed by private developers for high-end uses, residential, commercial, offices, and that in doing so, we're really harming our city, and that we are taking away local capacity to produce. And that in the midst of COVID, we saw just how important the local production was when international and so many other supply chains were overburdened, were broken, were delayed, and that this is going to local production and green industrial manufacturing will be such a large and necessary part of building for a climate resilient future. Retaining and creating well-paid and working class jobs. Historically, Sunset Park is one of the largest walk-to-work communities, and between some of the climate policies that I've mentioned, they are slated to create over 200,000 jobs in the state. And so really connecting land use and zoning decisions with how successfully and effective to bring these types of jobs, to create these types of jobs. Because the state and the city, we have these ambitious emission reductions goals. And to reach these goals, we're going to have to build a new economy. We're going to have to build, renewable energy systems and new systems. And it's how to make decisions so that in order to meet those goals, it is coupled very closely, directly to job creation and local job training. And that these two things don't inherently happen. And that we have to, what needs to be done in terms of training and workforce development to truly make clean energy, climate jobs accessible to the local communities, to communities who have been the reluctant hosts of fossil fuel infrastructure for decades. How does that happen? And, what does that look like on a regional, national scale? The presenters before me talked about different scales, and it's really seeing how this project and making sure that we also don't stay, in one scale, but looking at how what we do today, right outside, sorry, wrong direction, but right outside the window, 2 blocks away, what happens over there? The decisions and the models and the processes that we are implementing there, how that can be a model for not only the city, but for the region and the country in terms of what does offshore wind development look like, but what does an equitable offshore wind development process look like, and how can that truly support, not just meaningful community engagement, but meaningful community decision making, meaningful community leadership? How can we create these types of models? Because it's all starting right here. And how can we what can we do today to make sure that these models are not only equitable but successful and replicable all over the country and the world? And New York is a very unique place where we have these policies. We have a lot, and it's really about what framework and what lens are we taking to ensure that environmental justice communities like Sunset Park are are at the table, are involved in decision making, and that we can't have equity as a goal without starting with equity, and that it has to be a process and a practice. And so, I'm going to end with this. Also, thank you, Economic Double, for the picture. And that, this is, again, a rendering from Ecuador of the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal. Really looking at and understanding that clean energy development is not inherently equitable. And that's why it's the process in that just transition, the understanding that just transition is procedural, and looking at, where's the funding? How is the funding being moved? Who are the decision makers and the stakeholders? And how are decisions being made? How is information being shared? Who's at the table? Who's not at the table? And understanding all those nuances, the procedural nuances, is really understanding how to implement or operationalize a just transition. And that very often we see people refer to a just transition only in terms of energy, and looking at it just only purely either energy or emissions. And, how do we get to net zero? How do we get to, zero emissions? How do we get to 100% or 70% renewable? And it's so much more than that. It's how do we get there in an equitable process? And so understanding that clean energy and energy development in general, not just offshore wind, solar and other renewables and other renewable technologies, understanding that they are not inherently equitable, and that it's the intentional creation of an equitable process that's going to get us to a just transition. And that, where we Uppers has long advocated for offshore wind in South Brooklyn before any RFPs, before any of this, that really for decades thinking about what does a green port, what does the green reindustrialization of an industrial waterfront look like, and how our industrial valued industrial land and spaces are at the heart of building for climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. And like I said, not only for the community of the state, but for the region, being the first, U.S. assembly and staging port. And that, these are all of on the left here, all the other things we're thinking about. Of course, that was also mentioned: local manufacturing, port electrification, training and development, and how to support existing local businesses as well. Not only attracting, new sustainable or green businesses, but how to support local businesses into a just transition. And these are all going to be vital parts that we are going to be continued to advocate and engage on, and that is these environmental justice principles that are always guiding all of our work. And that's a big piece of ensuring that these jobs, these thousands of jobs, exciting clean energy jobs, are truly accessible to the community, and they're not just created, but that they're accessible. And understanding the needs directly from the community is going to be the first step in building that pathway, that vine into clean energy careers for community members who are underemployed and are working 2 to 3 jobs just to make ends meet. So I'm going to stop there. Really appreciate again for the invitation to be here. Thank you. And if you, feel free to follow us on social media and everything. I'm going to pass it back to you, Richard.
Okay, thank you, Summer. Really appreciate that presentation and giving us that perspective. I should mention in reference to your last point about making sure that the people from the community get those jobs that are going to be high skill level jobs, that speaking as I know I speak for my college, New York City College of Technology, neighbors nearby, that the college is certainly committed to its community and the neighbors and making sure that people get that education and that training. And so now, thank you, panelists. If you would not mind coming back on, great. And we have a number of questions, some issues. I'm going to ask just one question, if I may, at the beginning. Just for me, if you've answered this and I just didn't get it, excuse me, but like, how will the wind turbines get from the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal to their place and, out on offshore, and how will they be placed there? Will they be assembled there? How will they get there? If someone could answer that, either, I guess, the Alba or Jana maybe would help me with that. I just want to envision it.
Yes. So, we have what is called service operation vessels, and very special vessels that will carry this huge components out to the sea and then assemble them at sea. You'll see some assembly on the port, but as you know, these are very large components, which for the most part will be assembled at sea. And Jen, I don't know if you want to add to that answer.
No, of course, Alba's the expert on her project. I would note, though, that for those of you interested in viewing some videos of different types of installation vessels, YouTube has some really interesting time-lapse videos of the installation of different wind farms. And I highly recommend it if you're interested in seeing how it actually works.
Of course, I should have known. YouTube has videos of everything. And if you want to know how to screw in a light bulb or fix a sink or put up a wind turbine, I guess that's where you go. Thank you, Jan. And here are some questions that have come in. Here's what I didn't screen these at first, so I will address this, and any of you can speak to this. There are no clear resilience design elements as part of these new built out spaces at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal or on Long Island. That would be a critical design philosophy to incorporate even at this early visioning stage. That is, how do you envision bringing resilient design into the facilities that are being created to create wind resilience? That is solar covered rooftops, coastal edge adaptation, nature-based solutions incorporated into these industrial sites. And they need to be visions of the future in all aspects. So would anyone like to comment about that? What are the designs? So we're hearing the technology, we're hearing the placement, we're hearing the energy, but what about the design of these facilities?
Those are actually, at least for our developments, those are actually considered, we're taking into consideration flood. So ensuring that these structures are elevated. There are also roof panels being considered, or actually in the design as well, not being considered. They're part of the design. And perhaps it'll be a better idea to share more of those simulations with you, Richard, to share with some of the audience at a later time. But that's something we can definitely provide so that they're more aware of those resilience elements being incorporated into the projects.
Okay. Would anyone else
Yeah,
want to?
Sure, I can just jump in and say that I think all three of us, all three panelists would share your concerns and your emphasis on resiliency. I think it's a focus of all three of us. And there's a number of different factors that need to be considered, not only, onshore, but also offshore when we think about climate adaptation and resiliency. And that's certainly something that, the state is mindful of. We actually conducted a report recently called Offshore Wind Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Planning that looks at those sorts of factors and what we need to be planning for, thinking about how climate change will intensify and eventually, have larger impacts on wind farms. So just emphasizing your point that those are the right questions to be asking, and it's certainly something that the state and I'm sure industry and I'm sure the community are all thinking about as we develop offshore wind.
Okay. Here's another question. All of this sounds so great for alternative energy, but is it green? What are we doing to our oceans? The huge concerns about impacts on the ecosystem, the efficiency and amount of energy expended against created in the long term shouldn't be rushed into. Are we replacing one problem with another one? Is there an open discussion and weighing of ecosystems impacts? Which developments are conducting impact studies and which departments, are conducting impact studies and evaluations? Again, I
can jump in here first, if that's okay with everyone. So Ronan, thank you for all of your questions and comments. I think I can lump a bunch of them together because I've seen your comments and your questions coming through regarding specific concerns about environmental impacts. And I can only speak for myself, but I think I'm definitely not alone in saying that I'm an environmentalist, and that's the reason that I'm doing this. We're looking for a solution to the impacts of climate change. So certainly we're not looking to replace one problem with another, but we're looking to work collaboratively towards the best solution that we can. Of course, there's going to be impacts on the environment, right? You're building an offshore wind farm in the ocean. That is why engaging with experts and continual really collaboration and engagement with experts is key to the process of developing offshore wind. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier is our environmental technical working group that NYSERDA leads, but that is a place where developers and experts come together in order to talk about these impacts and ways we can avoid, minimize, and mitigate those impacts. And certainly that technical working group is not the only forum for doing this. I'm sure Alba can speak to the extensive work that developers are doing in this regard. And then in regards to your questions about, state agencies and federal agencies, there's so much being done as part of the permitting processes in order to conduct studies as to the impacts and ways to avoid, minimize, and mitigate. And that starts even before offshore wind farms are sited. That starts with the federal government even before they decide which areas of the ocean are most suitable for offshore wind development. And then it goes all the way through, the review of the construction and operations plan, the review of the interconnection plans that come into New York State. So I'm sure that Alba could speak more to the extensive studies that are done on the developer side, but the state and the federal government are also conducting their own studies. The state is leading a regional effort to create an entity that will look at wildlife and science, wildlife and fisheries monitoring and data collection efforts. So I'll just say that, I echo your concerns and certainly we need to be very careful looking at sort of the life cycle analyses of these projects, but overall, this is the solution that we need to stop the impacts of climate change.
And before,
Okay.
I was gonna say before, Alba, if you jump in, I wanted to add a few thoughts. I think this is a good question and really, brings an important point to the table, or thought to the table of, I think it's also easy to really be, concerned and ask questions about about new technologies, about new things. And I think it's really important to also understand where we're coming from, right? In terms of we're talking about clean energy future, And it's very important and instrumental to understand the impacts on the environment to ensure that an environmental solution doesn't turn into an environmental justice issue tomorrow. But that, what about the, to understand the existing impacts of our systems today, that the three power plants I mentioned, they're all on they're barges, they're all, they're all on the industrial waterfront right there, spewing out pollutants that, as we all know, science, when it rains, goes into our waterways that, that really contribute to systems-wide exposure to pollutants, not only for the communities, not only are we talking about high asthma rates and heart disease and other respiratory, issues that are felt directly by the community, felt by environmental justice communities like Sunset Park, and not just Sunset Park, communities across the city that are adjacent to industrial areas that are, like I said, the reluctant hosts to fossil fuel infrastructure. And that, the existing system is so problematic and really perpetuates so much inequity. And I think that, of course, we have to ask the hard questions and we have to ensure that whatever we do is intentional with minimal impact, but it is fundamental to understand why we need to get there and where we're coming from and the existing impacts to our health and our environment with the fossil fuel dependent and reliant systems we have.
Thank you both for those answers. And I do not want to make light of Ronan's question, but at all. And the discussion that led is very important and significant. But I just would be remiss if I didn't say that by supporting wind power, you people are not murderers. 2 days ago, the former president of the United States was interviewed, and he said that windmills kill birds, they kill soil, and they kill everything. I'm sure that Ronan was not saying that, but I just think that these things are out there, and it was very funny, right? 2 days before we have this conversation, that comment was made and received a lot of play in some areas. So want to switch.
I'd love to add something, Richard, if you don't mind.
Oh, sure. Okay, definitely.
From the developer side, right? I think, no, those are the questions that we want to hear, actually, because that is an important part of informing our developments. And those are, as Jana mentioned, we go through very intensive and extensive studies to ensure that we're mitigating all of those impacts when it comes to fisheries, the oceans, marine life, wildlife. So that is all part of the work that we're doing behind the scenes. And that is why, it's partly why the offshore wind procurement and regulations and permitting takes so long, because of all the work that is being done behind the scenes. The investment that the developers have to make is very substantial, and they're all in favor of those efforts so that we are able, again, to develop the most responsible project that we can develop in those areas. Because again, we're not trying to add to the problem, we're actually trying to fix climate, right? And address those issues with renewable energy. So okay. I think the audience for those questions, those are the questions that we need.
Okay, and this might also be for you, Alba. At what cost will Equinor Energy enter the grid? Will it be market-based or subsidized? So, Alba, do you know? Has that been determined? Has that been spoken about?
Well,
the cost of the energy that will come in.
I think I would rather have NYSERDA answer that question.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So this is sort of my very basic understanding of the way that these projects get built and get paid for, and hopefully this is addressing your question. So when any offshore wind market project comes into operation, they'll receive two payments from the market. They'll receive a capacity payment, and this is true of any energy generator. Capacity payment and then an energy payment. Those are market prices, right? So if those pieces are enough to cover the cost of a project, then an offshore wind project in theory doesn't require a contract with NYSERDA. The reason that a developer contracts with NYSERDA is to cover this little sliver of cost that without us covering that would not make the project viable. So that is, we enter into a contract for offshore renewable energy certificates, or ORECs. And ORECs embody the positive environmental attributes of the project, which are not valued in our energy and capacity markets. And we don't have a carbon tax. So there's no way that those positive environmental attributes are being considered in the market. So we enter into these contracts it's an indexed value, it grows and shrinks, to make sure that the project is viable. Were it not for those contracts, we wouldn't be able to have offshore wind energy. But as you'll see in various market reports across the world, offshore wind is becoming less and less expensive, more and more affordable. The prices are dropping dramatically, and you'll even see that in in the U.S. over the years. So very quickly, renewable energy is becoming very competitive with traditional generation sources.
Okay, there are two questions, and they're somewhat related and somewhat technical. Why have an energy cable span the length of 90 miles of the Long Island Sound rather than running it onshore? How long will it take to install? Wouldn't it be very challenging to maintain and manage potential disturbances from ocean currents, marine ecosystems, and weather elements? And then connected to that is somewhat similar. How will the energy be generated offshore at the wind turbines be transferred to sites onshore? If energy is transferred as electrical potential, how great is the energy loss in the transfer? So two questions about how it's transmitted and what are the effects of the transmission. So would anyone venture to?
Sure. So thank you for the question. There are various cables existing already undersea. To have something happen like that onshore, it would be a whole other element that we would bring into the project, right? But there's a lot of studies and being done to ensure that is being done responsibly. And then to answer the question about the electricity, we do have a substation that the electricity will feed into, which then will convert that and transmit it to the existing substation onshore, to the onshore existing Connecticut substation that will then deliver energy to the local community.
Okay. I have two questions somewhat related to jobs. And there's one says the public officials at Port of Albany have queried the real jobs to be located there. Since the real manufacturing is to be done in Europe and the parts brought to North America for assembly, they have doubts of employment prospects. I assume the work will be shared with Brooklyn. What is planned for each location? And another question is, are other communities part of this effort? Is the focus only on South Brooklyn, or is there outreach to other communities? What about individuals who may only have a high school diploma but may have the hands-on skill sets needed? So two job-related questions. One about what communities, what about the skill level of the workers, and the other about how much real manufacturing will be going on, how much employment will be going on. So I guess, Hannah, would you?
I can start with, that's a great question because it covers a lot. So I'll just start with one piece and we'll go from there. Are there, there was a question, are there other communities involved? Absolutely. Absolutely. So, as it relates specifically to the activities that will be happening at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal, NYSERDA has been, we've been building relationships with stakeholders across New York State for many years. And part of that is just regular communications with elected officials in all parts of the state. So, certainly when we talk with them, we're not just speaking with only people in the SBMT area about the opportunities coming to SBMT. We're talking to everyone about the opportunities coming. And certainly there are many allies in different parts of New York City who are extremely excited about the work coming to the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal and interested in how their communities can potentially be trained for those types of jobs. So of course, as we all have been mentioning, there's a tremendous focus on a just transition to a clean energy economy. And we want, local opportunities, we want local workforce development. And part of that is investments, state investments in local workforce development. So as I mentioned, we have this $20 million offshore wind training institute that's going to be competitively awarding these funds to training programs across the state. And certainly those funds are available to these communities, not only immediately surrounding SBMT, but as you just, go outwards, and many of them have existing training programs, they have training facilities that are interested in getting additional funding to, in order to adapt and build their own offshore wind training programs. And in our competitive solicitations, we're going to be prioritizing those disadvantaged communities and priority populations. So that's not only, your traditional academic institutions, but community-based training, labor groups that have their own training facilities, pre-apprenticeship programs. So certainly if you have only a high school diploma, there are a number of opportunities available to you in offshore wind. Having spoken with, several of these large global industry manufacturers, component manufacturers, they're looking for people who have a willingness to work, are enthusiastic, and they're looking to, take you on and train you. You don't need to have advanced degrees in order to participate in the offshore wind industry. They're very interested in working with local communities to make this a just transition. So I'll just stop there. There's so many other pieces to that question, but I'll let the other panelists jump in.
Okay. Summer, Alba, would you care to speak about any of these issues just raised?
Yeah, thanks. I can definitely jump in and pass it to Alba. I mean, this is exactly why it's so important to, truly value community expertise. That, we've been working in the community for, in and with the community, as also being community members ourselves for over 55 years, and understanding, what people, how people are employed and what are the gaps and what are the issues, is those are going to be fundamental pieces of building out a comprehensive and equitable workforce training infrastructure. So, of course, it's investing in existing training programs, existing workforce initiatives to have them grow, but it's from working directly with, communities to understand what are the gaps, what are the needs, what are the priorities in order for, someone who, wants to participate in a offshore wind, albeit direct or indirect job, to be able to access that job. And, those questions and those answers will look differently. There's both transitioning people who work already in related fields, maybe, they already work in a trade related field or in a clean energy related field, and they want to, get into offshore wind. But then there's also people who might work 2 to 3 service related jobs who don't have a high school degree. How do we also make well-paid clean energy jobs accessible to community members who have those challenges or those backgrounds? And it's really hearing directly from the community, working with the community. It's going to create a successful program. How do you measure success, in this instance? And it's really answering those questions as well. That's going to be, that's why when I was presenting, talking about truly accessible, like what does truly accessible mean? That's a lot. That could be a whole other 3-hour, presentation in itself. How do we truly make these, not just offshore wind, not just direct offshore wind, indirect jobs, but clean energy jobs, both direct and indirect, and existing community businesses? How do we include everyone in terms of making jobs, making resources, and making development opportunities accessible? And that's really at the heart of this. I'll pass it to you, Alba.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll say something quickly as I'm looking at the time. I agree with both Summer and Jana. It's about working with the community and identifying those gaps. We are internally working with our vendors and suppliers to ensure that is being considered. We have developed internal targets, working in collaboration as well with NYC, DC, and there's a lot of work going on to contribute to workforce development and the surrounding communities around our proposed development areas. When we talk about Port of Albany, and we mentioned that there will be an expected 500 short-term jobs and approximately 300 long-term jobs. We're talking about, from the construction of the manufacturing facility to the components themselves. And we're partnering with industry experts that are manufacturing, that are experts in manufacturing, but in a way, we then have to tie those companies with local communities to ensure that those groups are being hired for those jobs, and also providing the platform so that they can receive the appropriate training to have that easy and just transition that I talked about earlier.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'm going to close with one last question for all of you, actually 2 parts. The last several questions have 2 parts. Here's one. When you're answering the question, this is a sort of simple one. Is there a central clearinghouse for news on wind farm construction projects in the area going forward? And that's just a factual question. Where can somebody follow what is going on? But the other question is, I would like each of you to just step back for a moment and give perhaps an idea of your vision for what you see happening, or what you would want to see happening, what you hope to see happen. But just step back and expound for a couple of seconds as a closing remark. And I guess we'll go in reverse order of which you started. So Summer, can we ask you, please?
Yep, I'm gonna make it brief. One of our partners said it best, is that we can't let big fossil fuel become big clean energy. And what that really encapsulates is having environmental justice, frontline communities most impacted by fossil fuel infrastructure at the table, front and center, decision making, receiving resources are not treated like a checklist item, not treated like as in, benefits given to, but part directly into what a community-led model for clean energy development looks like.
Okay, and Alba, your second, both ways.
In terms of a centralized place for information, I, to be honest, do not know that there is one yet. I'm sure that that'll become, there will be a centralized place where someone can go and find information about everything that's going on. I know that NYSERDA has a great platform. On our websites, we have, information about our projects. Then if you go to BOEM, you'll see, as we talked about earlier, our notice of intent, which was published today. So there are a lot of different places, just not entirely centralized. And then what do I envision? I think as from the developer side, and as someone that grew up in an environmental justice community and understands the needs for climate change, I think I envision us continuing to work closely with community to ensure that we're not just developing projects for the purposes of profit. We're developing projects for the purposes of these ambitious renewable goals and for the purpose of supporting communities that have been wanting renewable energy for many years.
Thank you. And Jana.
Yes, thank you, Richard, for having me here today, and thank you to my other panelists. As far as a central place to get news about construction updates across offshore wind projects, I don't think that there is a central place right now. I would suggest setting up a Google alert to receive your news from all of those different sources that are covering offshore wind developments, because it's being covered from tremendous news sources down to the local level, and all of those perspectives are certainly important. And I echo what the other panelists have said in terms of a vision for the future. Obviously, collaboration is essential here, and I think the state hopes to continue to serve as a connector, as a facilitator in those conversations in order to responsibly and cost effectively develop offshore wind.
Okay, thank you for your answers. And Summer and Alba and Jana, thank you so much for coming here and speaking about this very important and significant project of concern to us along the Brooklyn waterfront, but also to New York and the country at large. And to those of you who have stayed with us until now, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for supporting the Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center. And this is our last breakfast talk of the academic year. We will see you again in September. And perhaps we will, at our next breakfast talk, offer you something more than a virtual cup of coffee. We might actually see you in person and be able to serve you some coffee and danishes. So to all of you, thank you very much, and we will see you again soon. Enjoy your summers, which has been opening up. I'm going to my first baseball game in a couple of weeks. So have a nice summer and goodbye.
Thank you. Likewise to everyone, and thank you for providing the platform.
Thanks, everyone.
So long.